Happy Wednesday, everyone. Thanks for being here. I hope this doesn't sound like read from a script. But, okay. Yeah. So we're launching a new tradition of these monthly speaker series. This is the first, so you'll have to bear with us as we go through like the hiccups of the production quality. But I also wanted, I also wanted to take a moment to thank our gracious host, Lena Anderson, who's standing there in the back. Lena is the Senior Director of Innovation Strategy at Singularity University, and she was really kind to, like, at the very, very last minute, let us use this space. So I'm again really thankful for that. And also, one of the things that was a condition of us using this space was to make sure we clean up after ourselves. So that's also there. So thank you, Lena. I also want to introduce our speaker, Yuji. So I've had the privilege of knowing Yuji for a few years now. We actually turned out, we were in the same program at Stanford, but he was a couple years older than me, so we actually never got a chance to meet while we were there. But he's the current engineering director for the marketplace and payments team at Facebook. He's been at Facebook now for 8 years. Before that, he worked on the developer platform and the ads system. And then before Facebook, Yuji was actually 4 years at Google, working on ads, Android, and the Google toolbar. And then before that, he's had a long career. He was an engineer at Electronic Arts, developing games for the PC and PlayStation 2. And he also started a company, start a company focused on digital imaging hosting for small businesses. And he graduated from Stanford with a bachelor's in electrical engineering. So please join me in welcoming Yuji. Okay, you guys don't need my introduction. So, but for Yuji's benefit, I'm going to ask a couple questions of the audience so that he gets to know a couple people from the audience. So how many of us here have worked at a startup outside of Verdigris before, by a show of hands? It's about half the group. And how many of us have worked at a large company before? So approximately half. And then how many of us here are or have had engineering roles before? Yeah. So pretty much the whole group. Cool. Yeah. So now you know the group. So awesome. I'll keep the mic near you.
Okay. Hey, it's nice to meet everybody. Thanks for having me here. Yeah. So Mark kind of gave a quick intro. I've been in technology pretty much my whole life. I'm a Bay Area native. As you mentioned, we both went to Stanford. I studied a double E there and then switched to programming after 1 year at Sun Microsystems, decided I wanted to be a programmer and have done that ever since. And now I'm basically a full-time manager and leader now. I don't get a chance to write code at work, which is sad in some ways, but like maybe it's better for the company that I'm actually managing people now. But yeah, happy to have a discussion here. Suggested that we maybe take questions, or I think maybe Mark has some questions.
Yeah, I've prepared a couple questions, so hopefully we can have a conversation and
okay.
Well, let's pass the mic back and forth.
Yeah.
Okay, so you mentioned that in your background, Yuji, I noticed that you had like product development roles. You've also had individual contributor roles. You've also been a manager. You mentioned that just now. I'm just going to walk through a couple of the differences between each of those roles. But as a product development manager, a couple people were curious, specifically, like, where does that fit in the roadmap of engineer to manager? Is it necessary? Like, if someone, say, is moving career or progressing in their career, is that a necessary role? Also, could you share your thoughts on how to shape a product from some arbitrary set of market needs, and then how do you turn that into specific engineering features?
Okay. So the first question was about being a product engineering person versus
a software generator.
And its role like on the path of being a manager?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I don't think it's related at all, actually. I mean, I think like being a manager is a very, very different job and a different skill set. And the product side, to me, I mean, there's been some great managers that came out of like systems and infra roles, which are very different from an engineering perspective. I think the most important thing for anybody who's considering becoming a manager is whether or not you are more interested in solving people problems, because that's really the main class of problems you have to tackle as a people manager. It's non-deterministic, it's difficult, and the kind of conversations you have are obviously a lot different. So I think that's the more important thing. And I think a lot of people, as they grow into more senior individual contributor roles, they realize if they have sort of the passion for that and the skill set for that. Sometimes they take a tech lead role. Sometimes they take on a position where they're representing the team cross-functionally, with other, actually I'm not sure how you're structured here, but at Facebook we have design and research and data science. All these functions come together to build a product. And so the ICs who kind of gravitate towards that collaboration, they tend to actually be pretty good managers. I think that's more important. I don't think like being necessarily a product engineer is a prerequisite for being a manager. And
so I guess the second question is then, I guess this is more specific to the product development manager, and we'll go back to that career progression component. But what is your thoughts on how do you take a nebulous set of product, like market needs, and then turn that into specific engineering features?
Yeah. So we've done it a few times. I've been involved in a few different products that we call 0 to 1. So we have basically an idea of an unmet market need or an area where we think we could do well, but beyond that, we don't have a lot of detail. So there's several things that we do to make sure that we're building the right thing and not going too far down the wrong path. So a lot of times it starts with a combination of research that we do and data science. So research would be like if we actually go into a market, we understand how potential competitors, how their product works. We can talk to actual people who are using those products to see what they like and what they don't like about that experience, and then figure out if we have like an advantage, either based on like our product, the way people use the way people use the product, or our skill set, like the people that actually work on the team. Data science, at a company like Facebook, actually, we have like a lot of people who use different products there, and so we can learn quite a lot about people just based on the way they're using it today. And so a lot of our decisions are informed by data. So we have like a strong data science team, an analytics team that will often make recommendations. Once we get started, we do, at least my team, we tend to ship pretty quickly. So that's like an important part of our development cycle, is we try to get something out in the market as fast as we can, because there's no better way to learn, to see how people actually use your product, to make adjustments. So it's challenging to do that, because you don't want to put something out there that isn't ready, or that's going to be a really bad customer experience, because you may like turn people off forever. But we do bias towards speed in that regards. And so in doing so, we need to make sure that the product is instrumented in a way that we can actually learn. So that's actually a mistake we made early on, was like we biased towards getting out there quickly, but we actually did not log everything that we needed to log to be able to do the analysis we needed to do. But that's an important part of our process, is actually shipping quickly. We're on a continuous deployment now. So basically an engineer could write code, and it could be live in hours. So it's terrifying in some ways, because there aren't many safety nets other than the tests that you write and the alerts that we have, but it does allow you to actually get feedback pretty quickly.
Kind of following on that thread, when you get to that first product that you're launching, is it just some well-formed hypothesis or opinion, or how do you guys go about getting information to form that first version?
Yeah, there's we attack it from a couple different directions. So we do have high-level strategy, right? So for instance, I work on Marketplace right now. We want to become a significant player in e-commerce. Right now, if you're not familiar with our product, it's basically like a tab on the Facebook app, right now is mainly used by people to buy and sell things locally. So you can think of it as like a much better Craigslist that exists on Facebook. We are trying to build more e-commerce experiences. So if you follow the news at all, like yesterday we had this Nintendo Switch deal on Facebook where you could buy it for $180. Yeah. So yeah, that's what I work on. Yeah, I'm sure you missed it because only about 1,800 people got it out of like, a lot of people. But yeah, I mean, this is like an area that strategically we want to go in. So that's like from a top-down perspective, like we know we want to do this. But where the rubber hits the road is like when we take a look at each market, right? Because the United States is one thing, but e-commerce in Thailand, for instance, is very different. We take a look at the research, so we see where do people already use Facebook, the product, to do commerce. And actually, spoiler alert, Thailand has a lot of people who use the Facebook product as it is to run their businesses without even any of the features that we've built for them. And so we see that, and we see that as an opportunity. And then we need to figure out like what is different about commerce in that market. Like I'm using Thailand as an example here. And we did a series of like in-country visits. And actually, like I just got back from there. I was there back in September, visiting with sellers to see like how they use our product and what their pain points are. So it's sort of like a mixture of top down and bottoms up, and trying to figure out how to launch the V0 of the product.
And what's the you mentioned going as fast as possible, but can you give us a sense of the time scale? Like how long did it go from a strategic initiative to the first version being out there?
I would say, I mean, it varies by product and product team. I would say that typically probably a couple of months is my guess. It probably takes us a couple of months before we get the first bits out there. Some things take a lot longer. I'll give you an example. Like I manage the payments team too, and that takes a lot longer. Like we need to do a whole lot of like compliance work up front. We need to do integrations with local payment platforms in these different countries. So that generally takes longer. I'd probably say a typical payments product probably takes us 4 to 6 months before we launch it initially. I've seen extreme cases where we had an idea. We have these things called hackathons where every couple months we basically stay up all night and just hack on whatever we want to. I've seen some of those go live really quickly, like just in insanely, probably not like what I would recommend you do all the time. But we've shipped things like in a matter of weeks after the hackathon.
I'm gonna shift topics a little bit and ask a couple of the questions that the audience had.
Okay.
One was like, what advice would you give to like a junior engineer about career development? And I think kind of to give the context of that earlier question of the necessity of product management in the role. Mm-hmm. One thing that I've personally felt that was interesting was the way in which being able to see how different roles tie in or play in mm-hmm. Has led to better formation of a thesis. But you've mentioned that if you're interested in people management, it's a different specific piece. With all of those things in mm-hmm. context, what would be some advice to a junior engineer who's trying to advance in career?
I think the first thing I would say is if you're starting out, I wouldn't think about being a manager too early. Like I actually think at Facebook, we have a lot of people actually where it's their first job. And they progress pretty quickly as ICs, and then they have to make this decision pretty early on if they want to be a people manager or not. And I think it's actually better. When I talk to them, I think it's better that they actually stay in IC for longer, because I think you learn a lot more about the kind of issues that ICs have by just being an IC for longer, and it helps you be a better manager when it's time. But for most junior engineers, people when we say junior, they're usually people who are right out of college up until before the point where they could say lead a team or lead a project. That's how I define a junior engineer. And I think it's like really important just to learn how to build different things. And so I try to get people to work on different kinds of projects. I try to make sure that there's some high-level splits that I think it helps if you figure out which path you want to take earlier. So like if you're like, say, systems versus product, like I think that's probably helpful to figure that out earlier rather than later. Because I think as you get to the senior, like right when you're on the cusp of becoming a lead, you probably need to have enough depth to be able to like make good decisions like on a project. So I would say, kind of after you've done a lot of the experimentation and you've sort of discovered yourself and you know what you really like, then I think it's useful to go deep at that point. Like work bigger project, work on a project that involves leading other people, helping set technical direction, doing code reviews, that kind of thing. I think it's good to get that level of depth so that way you can work on even bigger projects. Like the expectation once you become a senior engineer, and I think this is true at almost any company, is that you can be trusted to be put on a project and you'll figure out how to make it work, right? That's sort of the generic way to put it. Like that's the differentiation in my head when I'm putting together a team. I need a senior engineer on there who I could trust will figure out the right thing to build and the right way to build it. And I think you only get that after you've done bigger projects and you've attained some level of depth.
What are some things that you wish you'd known as an engineer or done more or less of when you were an engineer that would have prepared you better for where you are today?
Ooh, that's a good question. Where I'm today. I don't think I fully, caveat here, it's really hard to learn this without actually doing it. And so maybe the progression of my learning is normal, but like my perspective now, like on what makes a great engineer is different than it was when I started out. So I had this perspective when I started out that like if you wrote the most amount of code or you ship the most stuff, that you were probably the best. And I really believe that. Like I just believe like the harder you work and the more that you did, like the more valuable you were. And I sort of didn't see like the role that other people around me were definitely playing. I just didn't notice it. Like I just didn't notice some of the leadership aspects from the senior engineers on the team. I think like the ability to make hard decisions and communicate hard decisions with teammates is something that I just didn't even notice. I didn't even notice that people around me were doing that. And it's something that I didn't learn until probably 7 or 8 years in. I would have loved to learn it earlier. I probably would have been a better teammate when I was younger. But then again, like it kind of goes back to the whole experience thing. Like I really believe that like if you are an IC for longer, you understand the role better, and the manager transition becomes that much easier for you.
Now, kind of speaking as you've had like that perspective of both being an IC and an engineer and now as a manager, you've probably experienced the tension on both sides of this between the leadership of a project, the management pushing for stuff, and engineers who have to provide some of these things. How would you advise engineers to handle the perceived unrealistic asks from leadership? That was a question.
Submitted anonymously. What advice would I give? So I would say, it's really important to be able to like speak up on these things. I think like our job, and I'm saying our job, our being engineers, is to actually to always speak the truth on these things. So I would say it's important if you see something that is challenging, to actually ask the question. The other side of the coin, though, is like not everybody has full visibility in everything, right? There's often context we're missing. So when I see this happening, I'm sort of on the other side of the coin now. Like I'm sort of on the side asking unreasonable things and not knowing what the reaction is going to be. But like sometimes like the most important thing is for shared context, right? It's important for the people who like are making these asks to set context. Like very often there's existential reasons why you're setting a goal, right? Like there's something going on. There's like a competitor. There's something that's really important. And then on the other side of the coin, you know best like how the system works and what the risks are, right? And so I think it's important to have a culture where you're sort of bringing everything you know to the table and having that discussion, but also having an open mind that like you don't have all the context. Like not any one person has all the context, so the point of having a discussion is to share as much of that as possible.
That's really great. You kind of mentioned developing this as a culture, like that engaged dialogue between management and engineering to kind of break down those kind of assumptions about unrealism. But can you talk? This is a nice segue into like talking about culture and life at Facebook. How does Facebook build this culture with engineering management and engineers?
So Facebook is very bottoms up. You may have heard this, but as managers, actually, we don't make a ton of decisions. Most of the time, we look to teams to like figure out what we should be doing, and we provide feedback and guardrails. Like I said, sometimes like there's a strategic initiative. Mark wants to do something, and that we have to figure out how to get it done. But very often, for I would say probably like 70% of the teams and projects that I've managed, the teams themselves figure out what is the right thing to do. And that's been a key part of the culture. And I think like it's hard to say, obviously like I wasn't there when the company started. When I joined, it was about 1,500 people or so. And 8 years later, it's much bigger, but I still feel like that's the core. That's sort of the core of the culture, is that teams make decisions and managers support those decisions. So there's a bunch of little things that we do, I think, that help to reinforce that. One, as a manager, we never say that our job is to manage people or to lead people. We actually always say that we support people. So that way we're grounded in thinking about our role in a way that makes people successful, right? We're supporting the people who are building the product or making the decisions. So I think that's really important. I think another thing is like we put a lot of emphasis on transparency and leadership transparency. That's a big deal inside the company. It's one of those. This is probably the one that's been harder to scale. You've probably seen all these news articles that are written. A lot of these are leaks that happen. So the transparency thing is hard. It was a lot easier when the company was smaller, but I think that transparency is important, because the more transparent you are, the more context you have as a person on a team. So that helps you make better decisions, and that contributes to our bottoms-up culture.
You touch on a lot of the questions that I think people had, but I want to come back over a few of those. One of them was, you mentioned how the organization's moved from 1,500 when you joined to like a much larger group now. How does a company that is the size of Facebook keep employees feeling impactful?
I think one thing that we do, we're pretty ruthless on prioritizing projects, right? So I think one way to stay impactful is to stop working on things that aren't impactful, and we do a pretty good job of that. I mean, it has its clear. There's a lot of frustration sometimes if you're on something that gets shut down, where you feel like if I only had one more quarter, one more half, like it would have worked. We have bias towards being more aggressive on making those decisions, and I think it's allowed us to actually have more impact with fewer people. But there's a clear downside. Like I don't want to like sugarcoat that. Like a lot of the teams that I manage are upset when we decide that after 6 months or a year that we would be better off investing in something else. It can feel like you're getting thrashed, right? Like if that happens too much. So this is sort of a fine line that we walk. I think on the impactful side. We actually, this may seem just like it's talk, but we focus a lot on biasing towards impact also, and we do that like in our performance reviews. We do it when we talk about like teams and their goals. We actually always try to focus the conversation on what is the impact of what you're doing. So it could be, the most obvious one is like the impact your product is having, right? So if you set a goal that's measurable, you can see how you did against that, and we talk about that a lot, right? So it's part of everyone's thought process is like, how impactful is the project I'm working on? How impactful am I as an engineer or product manager, or whatever it may be on this one area? The downside to this is you can have teams, and actually we have quite a few teams, that all they care about is impact. And we actually suffer from that more than anything else. We suffer from teams that are so focused on hitting a goal. And when I say having impact, that means like smashing whatever goal we set, that they can lose sight of other things. They can lose sight of work-life balance for one. They can lose sight of quality, and investing sort of in a long-term stable infrastructure. So that's sort of the downside to that. But we've been pretty good at like staying focused on impact, and I think it has to do with the prioritization and just like the things that we measure.
So you talked a little bit about prioritization, and you talked about the decision making being like a bottoms up. Are there just as a more tactical, what does that look like? There was a question from the audience about using things like elected leadership and using things like unanimous voting or majority voting. Like, how did the decisions that are bottoms up look like? How do they get actually made? And how much of it falls towards like managers to say tie break, or and is there a difference between things like technical direction, product direction?
Yeah, no, those are great questions. And I realize, like, the way I describe things, it kind of sounds like contradictory things. Like, there's bottoms up decision making, but there's also like projects getting killed, right? And so that, like, they do sort of meet halfway. It's not a democracy for sure. Like, I don't think any company really is a democracy. It's more like a meritocracy is probably the best way to describe it. So a lot of the projects that start bottoms up, usually like the people working on it know that they need to show that it's going to be important or impactful to the company, right? And so the ones that actually make it are the ones that actually get noticed. So an example would be, a great example actually is the donations product. So this is a pretty big deal on Facebook now. So like on your birthday, you can have a charity that you raise money for. And I think we just announced some crazy number, I forgot what it was, that we've raised for charities for this product. But this product initially was just 2 people that saw an opportunity. One of them was actually on my team. They didn't report to me. There was a product manager on my team, on the payments team. And then another person came from the growth team. And the different orgs, like organizationally, were really far apart. But they saw an opportunity here. They saw a match with our product. They saw that like people often shared GoFundMe campaigns. That like there was this need for people to actually like do social good like on our site. So they built this product, and it took off. And so I mean, this is one of those things where they made it easy for Mark, and Mark actually really cared about making Facebook a good force for the world. And so this is a product that was probably really easy, you know, in terms of getting it actually greenlit and funded and launched. But yeah, I'm trying to think about other things that teams could do. So that, I mean, I would say the first thing is to pick the right product, and then basically show that it's going to be great. That's basically like how things get funded. Yeah, and as managers, it's still our job to make sure that like our resources are being invested wisely. So ultimately, it does fall on a manager to make a call whether or not it does make sense. Like, so not every decision makes sense. Like that comes from everywhere. So like that's where it sort of meets halfway.
Okay. Yeah. Since you mentioned this management role again of resource management, there was a couple of questions that came up. One was, how do you balance resource conflicts? Like, there's 2 things that I'm curious about. One is, last time you were here, you sort of mentioned that you have a lot of teams that have interdisciplinary skill sets, and most of them are small. How do you, and then you had some areas that turn into like deep specialization, like infrastructure or stuff like that. But how do you, basically assign and handle resource conflicts between teams, like specifically between the infrastructure and the back end?
And the product, infra
right.
Product. I don't know if we have a lot of conflicts there. Are you asking in terms of like how, like conflicts between the teams, or conflicts in terms of how I should be investing in those areas, or?
Yeah, I guess the question was asked in the context. I don't have a full context of the question, but I think the question was asked in the context of when you have a limited amount of resources. Maybe Facebook isn't in this situation, but when you have a limited amount of resources and you're like saying, here's some projects that need to get done, and you mentioned that one of the problems you face is that teams are so focused on impact and hitting the goals that they aren't always focused on setting up something to be successful in the long run. So how do you rebalance the needs there?
I got it. That's a great question. Well, it's a great question because we're actually going through this right now. Like what I mentioned is actually a problem that we're trying to solve. I think it was like almost 2 years ago now that at a company level, we decided that we were not investing enough in what we call better engineering. Better engineering is sort of this brand name for a bunch of efforts to make engineers' lives better. Like we want to make sure that we are making it so that like our code base is easy to understand and for a new engineer to get up to speed on. That as somebody who's debugging an issue, that it's not impossible to try to figure out what the root cause of a problem is. So we started investing in that like at a company level. Now, I mentioned the teams that like are laser focused on goals and impact and how like they can still neglect that. And that's still true today. So like even though we've been doing this for 2 years, it's been hard to actually get people to believe this. And we're trying so hard right now because like as an engineering leader, this is really important to me. Like I mean I see it like a team that has an unstable on call, it's the worst to be on. Like you get woken up multiple times a night, and it takes time to fix those things. So some of these things like are going to take a lot of time to fix, and so there's this trade-off here. There's a lot of pressure for us to hit these loftier and loftier goals, and so the expense is sort of a less stable code base. So right now, what we're doing, these are some of the things that we're trying. We are trying to make sure that we reward investments in infrastructure improvements equally as we do product impact. I think that's the most important thing we could do because like the way that we actually evaluate people during our performance review cycle has the most impact on the decisions everyone makes. And we're also making sure that all the functions that build a product are all bought into this and are all also evaluated on these same axes. It can't just be engineers because engineers could want to build more stable infra, but if the product and say design team they're being evaluated differently, then it won't match. So we're trying to make this thing real. We're trying to give it some real teeth because there's just so much momentum right now to build products to get used more, that like have higher conversions, that have more users, more revenue. That like we'll lose sight of like this important thing, and eventually it'll just be unmaintainable.
Okay. Another question that came up was about agility. So are you familiar with agile development versus waterfall? Can you talk a little bit about how you guys handle being agile at a company of the size of Facebook, where you may have like product roadmaps and things that you have to do? How do you do that, and what has worked and what hasn't worked?
Yeah, so we don't have a top-down philosophy on development methodologies. Most teams use some aspects of what's called agile technology. So just in terms of planning cycles being pretty short, and like, if you're talking about like scrums and daily stand-ups, like a lot of teams do that. We do try to evaluate and adjust our work streams fairly frequently. Since we're shipping so often, it doesn't make sense to plan a roadmap 6 months out. And so we adopt a lot of that, but it's really up to each team. And so I don't think I've ever seen a team that does a traditional waterfall with like a 4 or 5 month window. I think everybody has a variation of that. I would say typically it's between 2 to 4 weeks as a development cycle. I think another part of that is sort of test-driven development too, right? So like I think we have like pretty good frameworks to do this, but it's not sort of globally enforced. And so this is something that we're also trying to get teams to self-select into doing more of, is to build like a better set of automated test suites so that like it's safer to push code out. It's pretty important if you're doing these quick releases like in 2 week cycles that like you can catch most of these things before they go into production.
Okay. And I think this question, I don't know if this question came from someone in the hardware team, but it might. But does this same philosophy around development cycle exist even when you're like, say, doing something that may take longer, like a hardware iteration or revision, or also in groups that sell to businesses where they need to plan and forecast much further in advance? A lot of your sales team might be committing to things that are on a roadmap that might be farther out. And how do you guys balance the needs of your I guess sales teams and hardware roadmap?
I would say the closest analog would be payments. So I manage payments. Payments is a team that does not believe in moving fast and breaking things. Like that would be really bad. You may have heard move fast and break things as sort of a mantra at the company. We're trying to do less of the breaking things these days. But the payments team has always been more careful, has always had like sort of longer iterations and more in-depth testing before they release things. And so I think you have to be realistic, right? Like if you're building hardware and you're committing something to silicon, you can't like iterate on that. Like you can't. It's pretty expensive to put it out there and then fix mistakes later. So teams do have different philosophies. It's not a one-size-fits-all thing at Facebook. What was the second half of the question? There was a second half of that.
I think it was just about like when you have like sales teams. That
That's right. So we have a lot. I mean, there's a lot of commitments that we make. Some of these are commitments that we've made to governments to roll things out, and so have somewhat non-negotiable dates. And we still use most teams still use the short planning and release cycle. We have like a goal that we're trying to go to, but still like the path there is never set. So like we still like even if we know that we have something in 9 months, it has to be done for say the country of Brazil in payments. This is not actually hypothetical, but like a country mandate. We still do like those teams still do quick releases like because there's things that they'll learn. In the case of these payments ones, they're usually compliance related. So a lot of these are requiring us to collect more information from people if we're going to process payments from them and store them somewhere. And so there's a lot of iteration that goes on there. Like we try to figure out what is the best way for people to understand what we're trying to do and to have a higher conversion. Because basically if we don't get that information from them, we can no longer process their payment as an advertiser in those countries. So even for those, like we still do the short release cycles.
The next topic, I'll jump in before I turn it back to the audience because I think we're going to run short on time here. But the next piece is around hiring and firing. So I think there's a lot of curiosity about like what is Facebook's hiring philosophy, what does an interview process look like, and then also how does Facebook identify when it's time to fire an engineer, and how to decide when it's like just a fit issue, things like that.
Yeah, this is a big part of my job. So we'll start with the hiring process and the interview process, and what do we look for? So we're a pretty big company now. So I would say early on it looked a little bit different. I think early on a lot of the interviews were focused around mission and your passion for the mission, and that's like less important now because we work on so many different things. We look for people obviously who have like the core technical skills, people who have worked on complex systems. If you're out of college, like that you code pretty well and you communicate well. I would say aside from the obvious things like the technical skills, we value communication and collaboration a lot. The teams work together quite a bit here. Like there's very few silos at Facebook. Like if you're working on the marketplace team, it's very likely you're going to be interacting with like 4 or 5 different orgs that are very far away from you. So we really try to make sure that the people that we hire can communicate well, work well with others, can work through conflict, have high degrees of empathy. So during our interview process, we actually try to get that signal for ICs. Even for people right out of college, we look for it. We know that people out of college have a lot of growing to do, so it's not like the most important signal. By the time you've been working for 4 or 5 years, if it's still going to be an issue, then it might, that's something that we take into consideration in a hiring decision. For managers, so I do a lot of interviewing of managers. We look for a couple of extra dimensions. We look to see like how you support and care for people. Like, do you have a mindset of growth for people on your team? Do you look what are the things that you do to help people be better? That's something that we look for. We also look for execution related skill sets. So like how do you set and measure goals, and how do you measure success for teams, and how do you set up your roadmap so that like you are best equipped to meet those goals. So those are sort of the different kind of things we look for. But the common theme though is the ability to communicate well and work well together. That's something that's like super important. On the sort of the firing side, that's a really important part of our job. As managers, we need to. I want to like phrase it a little differently. Like the firing is really the last step, right? I mean, generally when there's performance issues, like our job is to actually help diagnose them and help the person grow out of it, right? What we tend to do is, as a manager, I probably spend, a disproportionate amount of my time like helping low performers. It happens quite a bit. It's a big part of my job. But the first thing that I always do is to try to figure out like what exactly I believe is the root cause. Is it if it's a manager that's struggling, like is it that they're unable to sort of let go of kind of being the technical lead or the head honcho on the team, and therefore they're holding everybody else back? Is it their inability to or unwillingness to compromise with other teams, and those other teams now are sort of stonewalling this team? There's a bunch of different things. So you try to like zero in and try to figure out like what is the behavior that the person is exhibiting and try to correct that, right? That's like the first thing. If it's an IC, sometimes like it's, it could be the bunch of different reasons. There could be external reasons. It could be that the skill set might not be right for the project they're on. But you have to spend some time trying to figure out like, can you actually correct that first, right? The classic question is like, as a manager, like how long should this take, right? Like because you could spend forever. It's sort of like the same thing that teams say. Like if I only had 3 more months, like I think we could hit this out of the park. So it's important for us to like basically set goals. So what I do when I'm working with somebody who is really struggling is I have to set goals. I said, okay, here in the next 30 days or 60 days, like this is exactly what you've been doing in the past, and I need to see like a change. Like I need to see you getting great feedback from teams whenever conflict comes up, or I need to see you like show that you can actually like solve these technical problems, whatever it may be. And then like I think like most of the time, if I were to look back, most of the time I think people, once they are introspective and they take a little time to think about like why they actually aren't meeting all expectations for their role and their level, like most of the people like kind of solve it themselves. So like either they change what they're doing because they realize that they just needed that feedback, or they realize that it's just not the right fit, and so then my job is to actually help them find the right fit. And so that's one thing that I spent a lot of time on, is like either internally or externally, like trying to make sure that the person doesn't kind of get into the same situation again somewhere else. Like that would not be good for that person.
Okay, you kind of described. Thanks for that. I think you described a lot about the role of a manager in this process, and you described yourself as one of your primary roles is to help find this problem. Is there a path where like how large is your organization today?
It's 200 people.
200 people. Yeah. So when you have that size of an organization and you're trying to identify where these performance gaps are, how do you enable your organization to identify where hiring and firing where firing or performance gaps are?
So, part of my job is to actually train good managers. So, like really, like the person I would expect to identify performance issues is that person's manager. And so, I spend a lot of my time in meetings with other managers and going over feedback, kind of going over like systems and sort of code like basically a lot of like metrics that we see for different teams. But yeah, like it's impossible for me to know like all 200 people and who's struggling and who's not, right? So like it's one thing that I think Facebook does pretty well is like we have reasonable ratios for managers to ICs, and we also have like pretty good training and support for people who are going into management. So like you get a lot of like there's a lot of like support structure that we have. We have pretty clear guidelines for what it means to perform at each level, right? So for engineering levels, like the expectations are pretty clear. Like there's many ways that you can achieve that, but the expectation levels I think they're pretty clear. So we make sure that managers understand that and can communicate it, and then help people like who have gaps. And that's probably the most important thing. That's how we scale. Like, because otherwise, yeah, like there's just no way that like I'm going to be able to tell where they all are.
Yeah. All right. Cool. Well, I have more questions, but actually, I wanted to, since we have only about 15 more minutes, I wanted to let the audience ask some questions. If you have questions of Yuji, if not, I'll ask the other questions that were in the thing. But if people want to volunteer the questions that they had, please feel free. Any questions from the audience? Seamus?
Yeah, so it seems like you work with a pretty exciting product. So I was listening to the portion about the payments and the marketing platform. It seems like you guys have had a chance to really get explore options in different places, get a lot of input and proof. And I'm kind of wondering to make these big decisions, do you how do you manage that aspect of having to get evidence of something successful? Is that something that's cultural or is a process? And how would you encourage? Is there a way that you kind of have to maybe force people to do that? Like, what's the strategy?
Yeah. Can you also repeat the questions a little bit?
Oh, sure. That might be harder than answering the question. No, but the question was like how we. I think it's like basically how do we measure success is one way of putting it, right? Like what kind of process do we put in place to ensure that we're accurately measuring what's a successful product and what isn't? Is that so we can make these decisions where to invest, right? It does require a lot of process and the right people working on it. I mentioned the different functions we have. So data science is a really important one. And so the responsibility of data science, and they have like a sister org called data engineering, is to make sure that we are measuring the right things and that we basically believe the results of our measurement, right? So like that's their job. Their job is to make sure that that's the first part of the job. The second part of the job is to actually do analytics on top of that, right? To actually help make decisions. But so that's something that we've set up. We have the function is independent. It doesn't report into product or engineering. It's like an independent function that can like stop something. Like they have the ability to say this is wrong or we're going in the wrong direction, right? So that function being strong is very important for us in believing that like a product is doing well or not doing well. Basically, like if you come to, I'm part of this leadership group for Marketplace. If you come to us and there wasn't data science involved and you're making a claim about how many people are using your product, then like that's not good. Like it's not good enough. Like the data scientist has to be involved in that. We've empowered that function to measure things for us, and that's how we have confidence that something is doing well or not doing well.
Any other questions? Can I ask a quick question? You mentioned this. You mentioned data science and data engineering as like two different organizations. Do those organizations share people with comparable skill sets and responsibilities, or how does that?
Well, they're actually they're sister orgs and they roll up to the same person. I think organizationally, I think they're centralized. One is more on information architecture. The data engineers are responsible for information architecture and logging and verifying that so in the code that it's doing what it should be doing. So they actually look at all, like the engineers write the code, but the data engineers are the ones that are responsible for the integrity of our logging infrastructure. They're also responsible for the larger backend systems that receive all the events that are coming from our products, right? So that's the data engineering team. The data science team is basically one layer above that. They do a combination of data science and analytics. So they're both necessary, but they're sort of codependent in that way.
Cool. So you kind of started off by when you were doing your introduction about where you kind of worked. I'm kind of curious from your experiences, what was your favorite organizational structure and why? What was your least favorite?
Org structure? Let's see. So I'll recap really quickly like the kind of places I worked at, just and that'll kind of help me make a decision what my favorite and least favorite was. So I won't count Sun. I was only there for a year, and I don't really remember much of anything there. But at EA, I worked on a video game there, and that was like a studio structure, right? So there was like a head of a studio. It was kind of run like a movie studio in some ways, right? And like a bunch of like each team was kind of working on a movie or a hit or a game in this case. And in that structure, it was, let me think. So there was a studio head, and then it was arranged functionally. So all engineers reported to a development director, and the artists all reported to like an art director, as I recall correctly. So that was interesting because that was a functional arrangement, but in a pretty small org, right? Because I think we only had like maybe 70 people working on the game. And then at Google, startup I won't count either because it's flat. Like I mean, it was really small. Like we were 10 people, so it was fun, but like it's not really an org at that point. At Google, 10 people is so small. Like we all report the CEO, so it's like let's see. Then at Google, it switched from being functional to business unit oriented, yeah. So when it was functional, I think the company had 20,000 people and like 8,000 or 10,000 engineers all reported up to one person. I forgot what his name was. And then it split off into business units. Now at Facebook, we've been at business units almost the whole time I've been there, right? And so I run engineering for our group, and it's roughly 200 engineers in my group. Now that I'm talking about this, you know what my favorite, my favorite, but this is just based on probably more of the circumstances. I really like it when a team is pretty autonomous. Like I really like that. I like it when a team like has everything they need, and I think like organizationally that works better if it's a sort of a vertically oriented team, right? So it's less coordination. It's like one problem you're trying to solve. There isn't a lot of communication barriers because you're usually all sitting together in the same location with the same manager. But that's not realistic for scaling. But it's just a lot of fun. I just remember being on those kind of teams and just like having almost nothing blocking us. Realistically, that isn't right for all situations. Especially if you get to the point where you have like shared technology, you need a team that sort of like oversees infrastructure, and then so you have to work with that team, and that's a necessary thing. But just in terms of my own enjoyment, I loved being in a vertical team that had 100% control over its own destiny. It's pretty fun.
I have a more general question. You mentioned, and we're kind of all aware that your company uses a lot of data.
Uh-huh.
And I am really interested in the wealth of data out there, how data can be used to shape the world. But I'm also apprehensive about how it gets used.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm wondering what your perspective is, how can we sit at this table responsibly?
Yeah, that's a very timely question, a good question. I think like it's very important that you have policies and rules in place if you're going to be the shepherd of that amount of data, right? Like it's important that those policies are well understood, that the tools that you have that you build like enforce those, so like people don't have to remember them all the time. Because Facebook is a large company and has a lot of people that use its product all the time, and so we have a lot of safeguards and a lot of processes in place to make sure that like people don't do something unintentionally that would be against policy or against ethics, or B, that there's nobody who is like trying to do it intentionally, right, or maliciously, or if there's like somebody who's there just to be harmful. And what's super important is that philosophy is believed at the very top level. Like it's super important. Like it's important that the leader of the company, the leader of each group, every manager actually believes in that, reinforces it, rewards and punishes appropriately based on that set of philosophy. So that's super important. Like if that actually didn't exist at the top level, then I wouldn't, then you couldn't trust anything that happens within the company, right? So that's why it's like super important. I know that like, actually I work at Facebook and I've been there a long time, and I know how it works internally, and I know the philosophy of our leadership, and I know it's not always reflected externally in the press. So it may sound kind of weird for me to say that, but like that's what our leadership is very good at that, and that's one of the reasons why like I feel really good about working there, is because the company is really focused and this is going to sound like a PR thing, and I apologize for that, but the company is really focused on bringing good to the world. Like that is like a core thing that we talk about all the time. Like all the conversations we always have are about like what are our products doing for the people that we serve. So that's like a very important sort of distinction and framing, is like we don't talk about, actually we rarely talk about revenue or data or things like that. I mean, we're talking about like how the product is useful and how it's actually like making people's lives better. And we use the phrasing, the people we serve. That's actually very important. It's sort of like supporting people as a manager, like as people building a product. The product that we're building is to serve people. So like I think like this is the most important thing. It has to be really part of the culture of the company, starting from the top, and then you need to make sure that you build all the processes. Like we, our tool chain is pretty robust. Like it's really hard. It's actually impossible to do something unintentionally that's wrong. Like I can't look at user data, like for instance, like you have to, there's so many checks and balances, people that review it, you have to meet certain kind of roles to be able to access stuff. Most of the time it's somebody who's like in operations who is trying to deal with, like I don't know, like, abuse, right? And then they would then get approval to do something like that. But we had to build that into the tool chain. It wasn't always like that.
Question about the technology stack. There's obviously a wealth of software, languages, frameworks, backend, also services that are offered by third parties for your development team. How does the corporate structure of Facebook guide the technical tools that the teams allow to use?
So we have a lot of the stuff's homegrown, like a ton of the stuff, right? We do, like a matter of fact, many of the things we actually open source, and so a lot of it actually is homegrown. There's still issues though, because there are competing frameworks within the company, right? Like there's many different ways to build a mobile app right now. React Native is one that you've seen externally, but there's other teams that actually have built their own that are slightly different. We're kind of a free market in some ways. There's some things that don't make sense to reinvent though, like sort of our database layer, like we built that and everybody uses that. Like our deployment tools, like those are standardized. When it comes to evaluating external platforms and products, we use some. They're really, I'm trying to think like if there's like a sort of heavyweight process there. Usually there's a team that does security analysis. So there's basically a vetting process to make sure that it's reasonable, that like it's secure, that it's going to be able to handle the scale that we're going to subject it to. And then at that point, like teams make their own decisions. Like, if it sort of passes the initial vetting test, then I've rarely seen a case where we say you can't do that. It's pretty bottoms up. Most of the time, there's something already available that solves the problem you want to solve at this point, right? Like we're at the point now where we've built so many things and battle tested so many frameworks that like it's pretty obvious, like as a team, that you're going to choose something. But every once in a while, like we do look outside, and like I said, it doesn't. As far as I know, I don't think there's a big heavyweight process for that. Like other than the vetting.
From a resource and like taking on new projects, how do you balance supporting existing work and then knowing when to add a new project or a new product in the line?
Yeah, this is really hard. Like because we especially like on a lot of teams that I manage have a lot of legacy products or products that aren't growing as much but are still used by a lot of people, and like we. Let me see, how should I answer that? I think like one thing we do is we actually do deprecate things pretty aggressively, right? So I think like one thing when we're talking about spinning up a new project is like we know that there's going to be like a cost to this. It's either going to be a cost to support it in the future, or it's going to be a cost to deprecate it at some point, right? So it's something that like we have clear eyes about. Like we know that there's a non-zero cost supporting a product. When it comes to I'm thinking about the teams that I manage right now. There are a few products that are not in active development right now. there's not many. Most of the products are like, we still have an active team working on it because there are things that we're trying to improve about it. The team may be smaller than when we were actually building it initially, but there's still people that are dedicated to it and will support it because they're adding to it. There are a few though that like are purely in maintenance mode. We're only fixing bugs. And in general, what we do is we have that with the original team that built it. Hopefully there's still 1 or 2 engineers left that understand it, but like that team owns it. And we try to staff the team enough so that like they can rotate the responsibility. It's not great, but like we haven't as a company accepted the outsourcing model yet. Like that's what some other companies like at Google, they'll send the entire product say overseas and have it owned by an offshore team, and we haven't done that yet. So it's just we kind of stretch to handle it and understanding that there is a cost to it. Like. Even if it's just maintenance mode, there's bugs that come up, like the thing could break in the middle of the night, and so that's like a price that we have to pay, and that's why like we factor that in when we decide that we want to do something new, and that we also make hard decisions sometimes to shut a product down.
Right. One last question before we wrap up. Any questions? If not, I'm gonna steal it.
Mark gets asked last question.
It's kind of related to the question Lily asked about data, and then your answer, I felt like there was some inconsistency between that and a previous answer, which was you said that belief in doing good, that belief that pervades the entire organization, which almost sounds like mission, is central to that data protection component, that wielding that enormous power of the data. But then earlier you said that when you're hiring, maybe in the early days, you focused a lot on getting people with that mission bought in. And now you focus on people who communicate well, have the functional experience and domain. Over time, as this continues for a period of time, will the company become something else, different? And would that then put tremendous power in the hands of bad actors or potentially maligned actors?
First, thanks for calling me out.
I'm contributing myself.
The softball ends here. Do I think it'll lead to bad actors? So maybe I should clarify a few things. I mean, when I was talking about like hiring, like in the early days and being mission driven, like that was like almost something that would prevent you from being hired, basically. Like if you weren't sort of tied into like the idea of connecting the world, like there's a high level importance on that. And I was just saying that like over time that's become less of a thing because we're doing so much more, right? We're doing a lot of different things. In terms of like the data stuff, like I think like it's super important, and I mentioned this earlier, that we have the sort of structure in place to make sure that like bad actors or anybody else or even like people who just make mistakes like can't really hurt themselves, right? Or hurt people who are using our product. And I would agree with the statement, though, the general statement, the company will change over time, like all companies do. Like when you grow and you learn, I would say that like our company was probably a little bit naive a couple years ago. Like I don't think any of us believed that like a state-sponsored attack would run a disinformation campaign across the country. Like no one ever thought that would happen, right? So like we have changed significantly because of that. Like it was sort of like a moment of I don't know, it's like, you know, when you become an adolescent or something and you see how the world really works. Like it was pretty shocking, right? And so the company must change and grow. But yeah, in terms of the sort of data protection, data privacy stuff, like that's core to the way we operate now.
Well, I want to thank you for coming.
Yeah, no, my pleasure. Yeah, thanks. Yeah.